So you're finally on vacation. You've endured the layovers, you navigated the nightmare at the rental car counter, you've unpacked your sunscreen, and you finally step out onto that warm sand.
Oh, the best feeling.
Right. The sun is shining, and right there, just flapping in the ocean breeze on this tall white pole, is a bright blue flag with a white circle in the middle.
And you probably don't even think about it.
Exactly. You just assume it's, I don't know, a generic welcome sign, or like, at best, a signal that the water is nice enough for a quick swim.
Yeah, it acts as this incredibly comforting visual cue. Like, the human brain sees that splash of blue fabric and instantly translates it to, safe, clean, ready for relaxation.
Definitely.
It functions as this subconscious shorthand for just a perfect, carefree beach day.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission for this deep dive is to decode the intense, highly regulated reality behind that little piece of fabric.
But it is intense.
It really is. We are pulling from a comprehensive Wikipedia article on the Blue Flag Award today, and it turns out that simple aesthetic marker is effectively a Michelin star for environmental management.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. Earning one of these flags requires passing this exhaustive, multi-point inspection. It uncovers the totally invisible supply chain of your vacation, from like microscopic bacteria levels in the water all the way up to the human rights of local boat crews.
The comparison to a Michelin star is incredibly apt, actually, because we aren't looking at some casual pat on the back for having, visually pleasing sand.
Yeah.
The Blue Flag is a rigorous trademarked certification. It's managed by this non-governmental organization called the Foundation for Environmental Education, or the FE.
Okay, the FE.
Right. And their international standard has quietly but radically transformed how coastal municipalities operate. It often forces massive municipal spending just to qualify.
See, I always assume these massive global bureaucracies are cooked up in a corporate boardroom somewhere, right? By a bunch of tourism executives looking for a marketing angle.
That would make sense, but no.
The true origin story is wonderfully analog. It didn't start with a boardroom mandate. It literally started with a message in a bottle.
Yeah, the foundation of this entire global standard is rooted deeply in a grassroots awareness project from 1985. It was initiated by a French man named Marcel Clebon.
Okay.
And he launched what he called the Message to the Sea campaign.
The mechanics of this campaign are just brilliant in their simplicity. Students were writing messages, sealing them inside glass bottles, and physically dropping them into the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
And the objective wasn't to, find a pen pal. The goal was to track where these bottles would eventually wash ashore. It was a physical demonstration of how localized human action, and specifically human pollution, spreads across the oceans and invades neighboring coastlines.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it provided a tangible, highly visual demonstration of environmental connectivity.
Right, because you can't just see a chemical spreading.
Exactly. Dropping waste in the water in one town inevitably makes it someone else's problem down the coast. And the current Blue Flag logo actually evolved directly from the graphic design of that Message to the Sea campaign.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they just removed the literal image of the bottle but kept the waves.
That is so cool. It's basically the 1980s equivalent of a viral social media stunt. You create this physical spectacle to force people to look at an invisible problem.
Yeah, it was highly effective.
But what fascinates me is how a localized French pilot program actually survived. Usually, these grassroots stunts generate a few local newspaper headlines and then just totally fade away when the funding dries up.
Right, they just fizzle out.
But in its first year, 11 French coastal municipalities adopted the flag. And at that time, they were mostly just verifying they had basic sewage treatment so people weren't swimming in raw waste.
Which is a pretty low bar, but a necessary one. But the survival and the explosion of the program really came down to perfect geopolitical timing.
Okay, how so?
Well, 1987 was officially designated as the European Year of the Environment.
Oh, I see.
So the European Commission was actively hunting for scalable activities to sponsor across the European community. They needed to show they were taking pollution seriously.
And they saw the flag.
Exactly. The foundation presented this localized blue flag concept, and the commission essentially supercharged it. They co-sponsored the initiative for the next 11 years.
Wow, 11 years of backing. That changes the game entirely. I mean, in 1987 alone, They went from those 11 French municipalities to awarding 244 beaches and 208 marinas across 10 different countries.
Which forces a complete evolution of the standard itself.
Right. You can't just check for raw sewage anymore.
Exactly. Transitioning from a localized awareness stunt into a formalized international standard meant the criteria had to expand. To justify that European Commission backing, the FEE had to develop stringent, measurable metrics for waste management, coastal planning, just comprehensive environmental protection.
And the program just kept outgrowing its own borders. By 2001, the organization actually had to drop the word Europe from its title.
Because it wasn't just European anymore.
Right. The Foundation for Environmental Education in Europe just became the FEE, going completely global. Today, they are operating in 81 countries.
It's massive.
You can find these flags waving in South Africa, Argentina, India, Japan, the United Arab Emirates. It's everywhere.
And operating across 81 vastly different ecosystems requires a highly sophisticated structural design.
I would imagine.
Yeah, the FEE maintains a strict international baseline of mandatory criteria, but they purposefully allow for regional variations.
Like adapting to the local environment.
Precisely. A beach in the Caribbean faces very different ecological pressures than a beach in the North Sea. The overarching rigor remains identical, but the specific application flexes to fit the local environmental reality.
So let's get into that rigor, because this is where the requirements become almost punishing for a local government. What exactly are these municipalities signing up for?
It's a lot.
Right. To get a flag on a beach, a town has to meet at least 30 different criteria spread across 4 massive categories. There's environmental education, water quality, environmental management, and safety and services.
And the water quality metric is typically where municipalities face their first major hurdle.
I bet.
A town cannot simply have a health inspector eyeball the shoreline and declare it clear. The sampling protocols are incredibly rigid. They require continuous, verifiable testing for specific biomarkers.
Yeah, when I first read about the testing in our sources, I assumed they were looking for like industrial chemicals or oil spills, but the primary targets are actually Escherichia coli, which we all know is E. coli, and intestinal enterococci.
Right, those specific bacteria are chosen because they are the most reliable indicators of fecal contamination.
Ugh, gross.
It is. Enterococci in particular are incredibly hardy bacteria. They can survive in saltwater environments where other bacteria might just die off. So finding them in the water doesn't just mean the beach is gross, it's a glaring alarm bell, indicating that the local municipal wastewater infrastructure is actively failing.
Meaning raw sewage is literally looshing into the bathing area.
Exactly.
And the FEE draws a hard line here. The criteria mandate absolute zero influence from industrial or sewage waste, but fixing a leaking municipal sewage system isn't just a quick patch.
No, not at all.
It often requires multi-million-dollar infrastructure overhauls, which means a town has to deeply financially commit to this standard before they ever even see a flag.
And that financial commitment extends aggressively into the environmental management category as well. A local government must establish a dedicated beach oversight committee.
Just for the beach.
Yes, they're required to install and constantly maintain public restrooms, proper waste disposal systems, all to ensure absolutely no dumping occurs.
They also start dictating human behavior, which is fascinating. If you are on a blue flag beach, you are not allowed to camp. You cannot drive a vehicle onto the sand unless it's strictly for emergency or maintenance purposes, and perhaps most contentiously for some tourists, no dogs or pets are allowed on the beach.
Yeah, the pet restriction often generates a lot of pushback. But domestic animals introduce foreign waste into the sand, and they actively disrupt local shorebird populations.
That makes sense.
The FEE is enforcing a hierarchy where the local wildlife ecosystem takes precedence over a visitor's desire to walk their dog.
Speaking of pushback, though, there is one specific environmental management rule I genuinely struggled with when going through our sources.
Good.
A criteria mandate that seaweed and other natural remains must be left on the beach unless it reaches a point where it's deemed, like, dangerous or severely disruptive.
Ah, yes.
My immediate thought was, wait, doesn't everyone want a perfectly raked, pristine white sand beach on vacation? You see these luxury resorts driving heavy tractors over the sand every single morning to groom it so it looks like a Zen garden. Why mandate leaving the seaweed?
It's a great question. And the seaweed mandate is arguably one of the most philosophically important criteria in the entire program.
Really?
Yeah. The FEE is deliberately dismantling our conditioned idea of what a good beach actually is. Tourism advertising has spent decades convincing us that a healthy beach is this sterile, flat, featureless sandbox.
Right, a completely sanitized environment.
But ecologically speaking, a sterile beach is a dead beach. That line of seaweed and natural debris washed up on the shore is scientifically known as the rack line.
The rack line.
Yes, and it is the absolute lifeblood of the coastal ecosystem. It provides the foundational food source for shorebirds. It houses millions of tiny invertebrates.
Wow, okay.
And crucially, as that organic matter breaks down, it injects essential nutrients into the sand that allow dune grasses to grow, which in turn physically stabilizes the beach and prevents coastal erosion.
So by forcing a municipality to leave the seaweed, the blue flag is essentially telling the tourists, you have to share this space. It is a living, breathing habitat, not just a playground designed for your aesthetic comfort.
Exactly.
The seaweed isn't messy debris, it's proof that the coast is actually alive.
The standard constantly balances ecological protection with human needs, which brings us to the safety and services category. Because an environment isn't successfully managed if the humans interacting with it are at physical risk.
Right. They require reasonable safety regulations, which translates to funding actual personnel. A blue flag beach must have lifeguards on duty, or at least readily available life-saving equipment, alongside easily accessible first aid.
They even mandate proactive emergency planning.
Like, for what?
For sudden catastrophic events, like a massive coastal oil spill, the town has to have a plan in place.
Wow. Public health infrastructure is also mandated, like providing accessible, clean drinking water. But the service criterion that most deeply reflects the modern ethos of the program revolves around accessibility.
This is a huge one.
This detail really caught me off guard in the best way possible. At least one blue flag beach in every participating municipality must be fully accessible for the physically disabled. We're talking about engineered wheelchair ramps extending over soft sand, specially designed accessible restrooms, and ensuring that the natural environment is available to everyone, regardless of physical mobility.
And building and maintaining that infrastructure on shifting sands is a major engineering challenge, not to mention a significant municipal expense.
Yeah, that can't be cheap.
But it highlights a core philosophy. True environmental preservation doesn't mean locking nature away in a vacuum. It means facilitating responsible, equitable human access to that nature.
But, pristine beach sand and wheelchair ramps don't mean much if the water washing over the shore is polluted by the massive boats anchored just 100 feet away.
Exactly. The water connects everything.
Right. Protecting the coast eventually forces you to look out into the water itself, and that's how the standard expanded its scope to tackle marinas.
Marinas are essentially complex industrial zones located directly on the most vulnerable edge of an ecosystem.
Yeah, they really are.
Because of the density of machinery and chemicals. The criteria for a marina jump to 38 separate, highly technical requirements.
It literally reads like a hazardous materials handling manual. A marina has to implement strictly identified and segregated containment systems for a terrifying cocktail of substances.
It's quite a list.
We're talking toxic paints, chemical solvents, boat scrapings, batteries, waste oil, and expired emergency flares. And all of this material must be extracted and handled by certified, licensed contractors.
And the rules concerning boating maintenance are incredibly strict. Think about anti-fouling agents.
What are those?
These are specialized, highly toxic paints applied to the bottom of boat hulls to prevent barnacles and algae from growing.
Okay.
Historically, as these paints naturally wore off, they leached heavy metals like copper directly into the marina, devastating the local marine food web.
Oh, that's terrible.
So the FEE mandates rigorous containment protocols. Absolutely no runoff from boat repairing or washing areas can enter the sewage system, the surrounding land, or the water.
They also tackle the reality of human waste on the water. The standard requires dedicated pumping facilities for boat toilets and for bilge water.
The bilge water issue is massive.
For those who aren't familiar, bilge water is that nasty, oily soup of water, fuel, and engine fluids that inevitably collects at the very bottom of a ship's hull.
It's highly toxic.
Yeah. And before these regulations, many boaters would simply pump their bilges and flush their waste directly into the marina waters.
So by enforcing controlled, licensed sewage and bilge disposal, the blue flag treats the marina with the regulatory seriousness of a chemical plant rather than just a casual parking lot for expensive yachts.
But the FEE didn't stop at the docks. In 2016, they realized they had to regulate the boats actually leaving the marinas.
Right, out in the open water.
They extended the award to sustainable boating tourism operators. This covers commercial activities like whale watching, bird watching, cage diving, and crude charter tours.
Regulating nature tourism is critical. The industry often relies on proximity to wildlife to sell tickets, which can be incredibly damaging to the very animals the tourists are paying to see.
We've all seen those distressing viral videos, right? Where like 5 different tour boats are aggressively chasing down a single pod of dolphins just so passengers can get a blurry photo.
It's awful.
The blue flag criteria fundamentally alter how these operators must behave to keep their certification.
The engagement rules are heavily weighted toward animal welfare. Any wildlife must be approached at a deliberately slow speed, granting the animals the time and space to evaluate the situation and choose to leave.
They have to have an out.
Exactly. Tour boats are strictly forbidden from encircling, trapping, or chasing any marine life.
And the acoustic rules are equally intense. When a boat is in the direct vicinity of wildlife, the engine noise must be reduced to an absolute minimum, and the engine should be put into neutral whenever appropriate.
Because the acoustic footprint of a boat is often far more damaging than its physical presence.
I wouldn't have even thought of that.
Oh. Yeah. High decibel engine noise can completely disrupt the echolocation capabilities of marine mammals. It interferes with their ability to hunt, navigate, and communicate with their pods.
Wow.
The standard even accounts for herd dynamics. Special precautions must be taken around breeding animals or calves to ensure mothers aren't separated from their young by an aggressive boat maneuver.
But nestled inside all these regulations about engine decibels and bilge water is an entire section dedicated to social responsibility.
Yes, the social criteria.
To get a blue flag on your tour boat, you have to prove to the FDE that you do not discriminate in your hiring practices based on gender, sexual orientation, disabilities, origin, or religious affiliation.
It's very comprehensive.
Furthermore, operators are mandated to pay fair salaries that align with the income level of their specific country, and they must strictly respect legal working ages.
Seeing labor laws and anti-discrimination policies embedded in an environmental certification often surprises people initially.
It definitely surprised me. It feels like they bolted an HR and ethics department for the ocean right onto an ecological award.
What's fascinating here is when you analyze this through the lens of modern sustainable tourism, it reveals why it's a necessary metric. The FEE operates on the understanding that sustainability is an interconnected web.
How do you mean?
Well, you cannot divorce the ecological health of a bay from the economic and social health of the community living on its shores.
Because a tour operator who is willing to exploit their deckhands to save a few bucks is almost certainly willing to illegally dump their bilge water to save a few more.
Exactly that. Exploitative labor practices are a massive red flag for overall corporate noncompliance. You can't legitimately claim to be protecting a whale sanctuary if you are actively impoverishing the local human population.
That is such a good point.
The FEE is asserting that true sustainability must be holistic. It has to encompass the ecological, the economic, and the social.
So with all these punishingly strict rules in place, the continuous water sampling, the million-dollar accessible ramps, the hazardous waste contracts, and the audited labor practices, how are countries actually measuring up? Like, is anyone actually passing this test?
Oh, the global participation numbers are staggering.
Yeah.
Following the 2024 award cycle, there are currently 5,010 blue flags waving worldwide.
Over 5,000 locations passing that 30-point inspection. That is wild. And the data from our sources reveals an undisputed heavyweight champion in this arena.
Yes, it does.
As of 2024, Spain holds an astonishing 747 total flags.
It's an incredible number.
Breaking that down, they have 638 certified beaches, 102 marinas, and 7 tour boats.
Spain maintains a massive lead over the rest of the world. The other major competitors are Greece with 617 total flags, Turkey with 614, and France, the birthplace of the program, with 503.
And a logistical detail from the sources kind of explains how these numbers roll out. The FEE doesn't just announce all 5,000 flags on the same day.
No, they don't.
Because global tourist seasons are flipped, they announce the awards on a rolling geographic schedule. The Northern Hemisphere, so Europe, Canada, places like that, gets their results on June 5th.
Right.
The Southern Hemisphere, places like the Caribbean, New Zealand, and South Africa get their results on November 1st.
And this timing is highly strategic. It ensures the newly awarded flags hit the press right as tourists in those respective hemispheres are actively booking their summer holidays.
Which brings up a massive practical question for me. Why is Spain dominating this leaderboard so heavily? I mean, having 747 flags isn't just about having a long coastline.
Not at all.
Upgrading the sewage treatment for over 600 municipalities and staffing them with lifeguards and oversight committees requires an astronomical amount of government funding. Why foot that bill?
The motivation is a masterclass in the intersection of environmentalism and economics.
Okay.
Countries like Spain, Greece, and Turkey invest billions into meeting these criteria because the blue flag is perhaps the most lucrative, internationally recognized tourist draw in the world.
It acts as this incredibly powerful, independently verified marketing tool.
Exactly. Families booking international holidays actively filter their searches for blue flag beaches. They want the guarantee of safe swimming water, clean public restrooms, and professional lifeguards.
Of course.
For a nation whose GDP is heavily reliant on coastal tourism, investing the capital to modernize sewage treatment and build accessible infrastructure isn't just a sunk cost. It generates a massive return on investment through sustained tourism revenue.
It completely shatters the old myth that environmental conservation is inherently hostile to economic growth.
It really does.
When an ecological standard is respected and demanded globally, protecting the habitat actually becomes the most profitable business model available.
It initiates a powerful, positive feedback loop. As more tourists become educated and demand sustainable, clean destinations, neighboring municipalities are economically forced to upgrade their own infrastructure just to compete for those tourist dollars.
It's just an incredible evolution. We started this journey looking at a handful of French students dropping glass bottles into the Atlantic to visualize pollution.
Yeah.
And today we are looking at a hyper-complex global regulatory machine that forces municipal governments to test for microscopic bacteria, protect the ecological rackline of seaweed, build wheelchair infrastructure over sand, and audit the human rights practices of tour boats.
It demonstrates how a localized desire for clean water can be engineered into an actionable, measurable standard, one that holds global economies accountable for their coastlines.
So to you listening, the next time you endure the travel stress, you step onto the sand and you see that bright blue flag with the white circle flapping in the wind, you now know the reality. You know the massive logistical, financial, and environmental gauntlet that local government had to run just to get that piece of fabric on the pole.
But before we close, the history of this massive financial investment raises a critical question to mull over.
Okay, what's that?
In our sources, there's a fascinating detail about the initial rollout of the strict criteria back in the late 1980s. When the rules became heavily regulated, several highly famous, traditionally popular beaches completely failed the tests and were denied the flag.
Oh, wow.
Simultaneously, smaller, lesser-known municipalities that had quietly done their environmental homework earned the flag and were suddenly thrust into the international spotlight.
They essentially leapfrogged the famous resort towns just by passing the FEE inspection.
They did. But consider the long-term modern implications of that dynamic, because meeting these Sunny Plus criteria requires immense, sustained municipal funding for water testing facilities, licensed waste contractors, and infrastructure. Does the quest for a blue flag accidentally create a two-tier system for nature?
Oh, I see. You essentially have to be wealthy to be officially certified as natural.
Precisely. Do the lesser-known beaches that manage to secure the funding and the flag inevitably become gentrified, overcrowded, and hyper-commercialized by the resulting influx of tourists?
That's a huge risk.
And on the flip side, what happens to the stunning wild beaches in poorer, underfunded municipalities? If a town simply lacks the tax base to build a specialized wheelchair ramp or hire a dedicated oversight committee, do their perfectly pristine beaches get implicitly labeled as unsafe or dirty and abandoned by the tourism economy? Wow, that completely fractures how you view the entire coastline. The very standard designed to save an ecosystem might simultaneously act as the billboard that gentrifies it while leaving less wealthy communities in the dark.
It's a complicated reality.
It definitely is something to think about the next time you're sitting on the sand, watching that blue flag waving in the breeze.
You know, you look at a map of Europe and your brain just kind of automatically breaks it down into these familiar shapes.
Right, the classic shapes.
Yeah, like Italy's the boot, the Iberian Peninsula is that big solid square block down in the southwest, and then there's the southeast corner.
Ah, yeah.
A place you've literally heard of your entire life, right? A region that has dominated global headlines, sparked world wars, birthed entire ancient civilizations.
It really has.
But what if the very ground you're picturing, like the way it's categorized on that map you have in your head, is just a complete cartographic illusion?
It's wild to think about, but it's true. It is honestly one of the most enduring geographical fictions of the modern era.
Yeah.
Just a mistake drawn in ink that over time became a strict geopolitical reality.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Today, we are pulling everything from one incredibly detailed source. It's a comprehensive Wikipedia deep dive on Balkans.
And there's so much to unpack there.
Oh, absolutely. The mission for today's deep dive is to unpack these geographical illusions, the bloody ancient myths, and, the shifting modern identities of southeastern Europe. We really want to help you understand why the word Balkan is one of the most loaded terms in all of geography.
Yeah, and welcome to the deep dive, by the way. We are going to help you navigate this really complex geopolitical labyrinth. Because honestly, understanding this region isn't just about memorizing some historical dates.
Right.
It's about having this profound aha moment regarding how we draw lines on maps and how those lines end up defining the people living inside them.
Well, to even begin talking about the history of the people, we have to talk about the land itself and how the very concept of the Balkan Peninsula is built on a massive 19th century geographical mistake.
A total mistake. It traces back to 1808.
Right, to a German geographer, August Zühn.
Exactly. Zühn coined the concept. He was looking at early 19th century maps and decided to group this entire southeastern chunk of Europe into one neat little physical category.
But his assumption was completely flawed, wasn't it?
Fundamentally, he operated under the assumption that the Balkan Mountains, which run through modern-day Bulgaria, were this impenetrable, unbroken wall of rock.
Like a giant fence.
Right. A fence stretching entirely across the region, from the Adriatic Sea all the way over to the Black Sea. He thought this mountain range physically severed the landmass from the rest of Europe,
making everything south of it a peninsula. But I'm guessing he hadn't actually walked that terrain himself to verify this giant continent-spanning wall.
He definitely had not. If you actually go there, the Balkan Mountains do not span the entire region. They don't even come close to the Adriatic Sea.
Wow.
Yeah, there are massive gaps, wide river valleys, entirely separate mountain ranges. It is highly porous terrain. But, the bigger issue for modern geographers isn't even just the mountains.
Oh.
It's the strict mathematical definition of a peninsula, which this region completely fails.
Okay, wait. I always just thought a peninsula was land surrounded by water on three sides. Like Florida is a peninsula. Korea is a peninsula.
That's the elementary school definition, sure. But geographically, there is a proportional mechanism at play. To technically qualify as a peninsula, the sea borders, the coastlines, must be significantly longer than the land border that attaches it to the mainland.
Oh, I see.
The land border has to be the short side of the shape. So when you measure the Balkans, you draw a line across the top from Trieste in Italy all the way across to Odessa in Ukraine.
Which is a massive stretch of land.
It is. That land border is roughly 1,330 to 1,365 kilometers long.
If I'm driving from Italy to Ukraine, I'm crossing through half of Europe.
Exactly. And that's the mathematical failure. That land border is actually longer than the sea borders running down the coastlines to Greece. The top is just simply too wide.
So calling it a peninsula is like calling a hot dog a sandwich. It's technically a huge stretch, but it caught on because we just needed a word for it.
That's a great way to put it, because if we apply Zühn's logic to the rest of the continent, cities way up on the Baltic Sea in northern Germany are technically closer to Italy than Ukraine is.
That's crazy.
Right. Yet nobody calls Central Europe a peninsula. Because of this structural reality, modern geographers completely reject the term Balkan Peninsula.
So it's not just a slight miscalculation, it's structurally invalid. But if geographers eventually realized the math was wrong and there was no giant mountain wall, why didn't they just fix the map? Why did all these empires so readily embrace this specific mistake?
What's fascinating here is how geography is just so frequently subordinated to politics. The European empires of the 19th century, they weren't looking for geological truth.
They were looking for control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They desperately needed a political container. At that time, the Ottoman Empire controlled vast swaths of this region, a territory they called Rumelia.
Right.
European powers needed a neutral-sounding, quote-unquote, scientific geographical term to describe this Ottoman-controlled chunk of Europe, but without actually validating Ottoman ownership.
Oh, I get it. So Balkan Peninsula provided that convenient bounded box.
Yes, precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because since the region isn't a true peninsula, where did the name actually come from? The source material goes deep into the etymology, and the transition from ancient names to modern names is honestly kind of jarring.
It really is. It reveals a lot about who was standing on those mountains at any given time in history. If you go back to classical antiquity, the indigenous Thracians called the mountain range Haemus.
Famous.
Yes, and Greek mythology provides the cultural mechanism for that name. You see, the word haima in ancient Greek translates to blood.
And just to be clear, the Greeks weren't using blood in a metaphorical, like, blood, sweat, and tears kind of way, right? They literally meant a rainstorm of monster blood.
They did. The myth describes an apocalyptic battle between Zeus and Typhon. Typhon was this monstrous fire-breathing titan.
Okay.
So Zeus hurls a thunderbolt, striking Typhon, and the titan's blood violently splatters across the rock face, permanently tainting the peaks.
Wow.
So in the myth, the Haemus Mountains were literally born from divine violence.
Which is such an incredibly dramatic, towering image. You picture these majestic crimson peaks, but then, we fast forward to the 14th century, and the branding shifts entirely when the Ottomans arrive.
It's a very different vibe. The word Balkan enters the historical record via a 14th century Arab map, and it's rooted in Turkic and Persian languages.
Okay, so what does it mean?
Well, in Ottoman Turkish, Balkan simply translates to a chain of wooded mountains. But if we dig into the Proto-Turkic linguistic roots, it breaks down into balk, meaning mud or clay.
Mud.
Right, mud, combined with the suffix an, which implies a swampy, dense forest.
That contrast is just unbelievable. I mean, think about it. Which version would you rather put on a tourism brochure? You go from the ancient Greeks looking up at the sky, writing poetry about mountains bathed in the blood of a titan.
To an Ottoman general.
Yeah. To a general dragging heavy artillery through the rain, looking at his muddy boots and naming the region a muddy, swampy forest.
It really highlights the difference between observing a landscape from a philosophical distance versus physically having to march an army through it. The Ottoman term was purely tactical.
Just a miserable, muddy terrain to navigate.
Exactly. And ironically, it was this highly practical, muddy Ottoman term that an English traveler named John Bacon Sorry Morit popularized in the West in the late 1700s.
And then August Zune just slapped it onto his map.
That's the one.
So because there was no giant mountain wall protecting it, the region was fundamentally open to anyone willing to march through the mud. Which transitions perfectly into why this specific plot of land has been fought over so constantly. I mean, it's not just an arbitrary zone.
No, not at all. It is the front door to the European continent. Because it sits at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, its river valleys acted as natural highways.
The ultimate crossroads of civilization.
Yes. In the Neolithic era, around the 7th millennium BC, this was the exact physical corridor through which farming migrated into Europe from the Middle East.
So the knowledge of cultivating grain and domesticating animals flowed right through these muddy forested valleys.
It did. And people didn't just walk through and keep going. They utilized those river valleys to build incredible societies, old Europe's first advanced civilizations.
Our source specifically highlights a civilization called the Vinute culture, dating back to 5300 BC.
The Vinute culture represents a massive leap in human societal organization. Because those river valleys were so fertile, they produced significant agricultural surpluses.
And, when you have a surplus of grain, you suddenly have to manage it. You have to trade it, tax it, and store it.
Precisely. The mechanism of having too much food forces a society to invent administration. This is where we see the Tartaria clay tablets emerge from this region.
Right. These are fascinating.
They really are. These tablets contain a system of symbols that many researchers identify as proto-writing. We're talking about administrative or religious communication that actually predates the Sumerians in Mesopotamia.
Wait, really? It predates the Sumerians?
It predates the Sumerians and the Minoans in Crete.
It's wild to think that the foundational technology of human communication, like literally writing things down, was gestating in these very valleys. But that same geographic accessibility that allowed early farming to flourish eventually became a curse.
How so?
Well, I mean, if everyone can walk into your valley, everyone eventually will, right? It's like a geopolitical intersection with broken traffic lights. You've got these world-changing historical forces continually colliding, Romans, Ottomans, Soviets.
That is a very accurate analogy. It turns the region from a cradle of civilization into a constant fracture zone, just a literal dividing line for competing empires.
Like the Roman Juridic line.
Yes, by the time of the Roman Empire, the Balkans had literally been split in half by this invisible boundary.
So how did a conceptual line like that actually function on the ground? It wasn't a physical wall, so how did it split the region?
It was a deep cultural and administrative fault line. If you were a merchant traveling north of the Juridic line, you were operating entirely in the Latin sphere. The laws, the taxation, the military commands, daily commerce, it was all conducted in Latin. The cultural gravity pulled toward Rome. But the moment you crossed south of that invisible boundary,
The whole system flipped.
the entire operational system of society flipped to classical Greek.
So you have a single geographical space containing the absolute limits of two massive cultural tectonic plates. And imagine being the third person at this historical intersection, just feeling the whiplash of constant cultural shifts.
And then that pressure never really stops.
Yeah.
You have the Romans, then the influx of Slavic populations, then the Bulgars.
And eventually you end up with Orthodox Christianity, Roman Catholicism, and Sunni Islam, all geographically stacked on top of each other.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can really see how this deep layered history set the stage for the region's modern-day identity crisis.
Right.
Because when the Ottoman Empire expanded into the Balkans, it brought Islam and entirely new administrative systems. But it also brought profound geopolitical isolation.
Our source mentions a catastrophic population drop during the Ottoman era. It notes the population fell from about 8 million to just 3 million by the mid-18th century.
Yes.
5 million people gone. What is the mechanism behind a demographic collapse of that scale? Is that purely from warfare?
Warfare was a major factor. The Balkans became the militarized buffer zone between the Islamic Ottoman Empire and the Catholic Habsburg Empire.
Just a permanent frontier war zone.
Right. And when you live in a war zone, agriculture is destroyed and famine follows. But the underlying mechanism was economic starvation. Because during this exact period, Western Europe was discovering the Americas.
Ah, right. The Atlantic trade boom.
Yes. Global wealth suddenly shifted to the oceans. The Mediterranean Sea, which had been the center of the world economy for millennia, became a secondary lake.
Wow, yeah.
The land-based trade routes through the Balkans were essentially bypassed entirely.
So you have a region locked in continuous imperial border conflicts, entirely cut off from the economic explosion of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment.
Exactly. No one is investing in infrastructure in a war zone.
So what does this all mean? How does a region that served as the cradle of European civilization become a word synonymous with fragmentation and conflict?
It's a really tragic shift.
It is. I mean, it's like a geopolitical game of hot potato. Nobody wants to hold the Balkan label, so they just keep passing it southeast.
That's a very apt way to describe what we now call Balkanization.
Right, which is a term with a huge amount of stigma.
A massive amount. The term acquired this deeply negative global political stigma after the violent dissolution of Yugoslavia in the 1990s.
Because the world watched a seemingly unified state shatter into smaller, actively hostile nations along those exact ancient fault lines we just talked about.
Exactly. It cemented the idea in international politics that the word Balkan inherently means division. And our source highlights this brilliant, absolutely impartial synthesis by the philosopher Slavoj Žižek.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
He argues that the concept of the Balkans functions almost entirely as an imaginary projection of the other.
Meaning, nations use it as a dark mirror to define themselves as civilized and Western. Instead of just claiming they are Western, they prove it by pointing at their neighbor and saying, we aren't them.
Exactly. And Žižek tracks this geographically in such a revealing way. He points out that for Austrians, the messy, primitive Balkans start right across their border in Slovenia.
Right.
But if you ask a Slovene, they view themselves as the guardians of civilized Central Europe, and they insist the true Balkans begin further south in Croatia.
But the Croats don't accept the label either. They argue that they are a Catholic, Western-facing nation defending democratic values against the Orthodox influence of Serbia. So for Croatia, the Balkans start in Serbia.
And the Serbs deploy the exact same defensive mechanism. They view themselves as the historical defenders of Christian civilization against the Ottoman influence.
So they argue the Balkans truly begin down in Kosovo or Bosnia.
Right. The Balkans are always somewhere just a little bit more to the southeast of whoever is currently speaking.
until you eventually run out of land and hit Greece at the very bottom. And somehow, Greece escapes the label entirely and is rebranded as the sacred cradle of Western democracy. It's just a masterpiece of psychological boundary drawing.
This raises an important question about how geographical terms are actively weaponized by different groups to claim belonging to Western civilization.
Like the modern political pushback against the term itself.
Yes. For example, the Croatian president in 2018, Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović.
Right. What did she say?
She made a public statement explicitly rejecting the neologism Western Balkans.
And just to be clear to the listener, we are impartially reporting this. We aren't taking a side on the political validity of her claim. We're just looking at the phrasing.
Of course. Her argument wasn't about Augustin's old map mistake. She argued that diplomats should stop using Western Balkans because of the psychological baggage attached to the word.
She insisted the region should instead be referred to as Southeast Europe, which honestly sounds so much more neutral. Southeast Europe sounds like an emerging market you can safely invest in. Western Balkans sounds like...
Well, a place where empires go to collapse.
Precisely. By changing the label, you change the perceived mechanism of the region. Shedding the Balkan brand is a deliberate strategy to signal alignment with Western stability, but it really begs the question: can rebranding a region actually erase centuries of complex historical baggage?
Probably not overnight. But wow, we have covered a massive amount of historical terrain today.
We really have.
We started by dismantling a 19th century mapmaker's error that accidentally birthed a geographic myth. We looked at how ancient blood and muddy forests gave the region its names.
Sahemus in the Balkan.
Right. And how a crossroads of empires became this modern game of shifting identities and psychological hot potato.
It is a region entirely defined by the collision of outside forces. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering paradox to chew on.
Oh, I love a good paradox. Think back to the Vinci culture we discussed earlier. Consider the profound irony of human progress here. The Balkans were the very physical route through which farming, the foundation of human community, entered Europe.
They fed the continent.
Yes. And they birthed a proto-writing system that predates the Sumerians. This land was the cradle of early European unity and communication.
Right.
Yet today, due to centuries of imperial border drawing and isolation, this exact birthplace of connection is globally synonymous with the word balkanization.
Which literally means division and fragmentation.
Exactly. How does the birthplace of European connection become the dictionary definition of being broken apart?
That is just, wow, such a heavy irony. It really shows how the lenses we use to view our maps are heavily distorted by the people who originally drew them.
They absolutely are.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the lines drawn on your own maps because, as we've seen today, the ground beneath them is rarely as simple as the label suggests.
Thanks for listening. If you hear the word immolation, you probably immediately picture fire.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it's almost impossible not to. But what if I told you that for hundreds of years, the word actually had absolutely nothing to do with burning?
It's one of those linguistic shifts that completely obscures the original meaning. When we look at the stack of sources we've compiled for you today, the origin of that word is actually the master key to understanding the entire phenomenon.
And that is exactly what we are doing today. Welcome to this deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we are taking a really comprehensive historical and sociological look at one of the most extreme, arresting acts a human being can commit.
Right. Self-immolation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I want to acknowledge right up front that we are dealing with some really intense, heavy material here today, but our mission isn't to just fixate on the shocking headlines you might see on your feed.
Exactly. We want to dig into the profound history, the really stark biological reality, and the complex political evolution behind this act.
Right, because we want to understand how an ancient practice of religious devotion eventually transformed into a modern, widely broadcast geopolitical weapon.
And to do that, we have to look past the flames. We need to examine the deep cultural frameworks and the physiological mechanics at play, because understanding this act reveals something profound about human conviction and about how desperately people seek to break through the normal rhythm of society when they feel completely unheard.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we can even begin to understand why someone would do this, we need to understand exactly what it is. And like I mentioned at the top, that starts with the surprising etymology of the word itself.
Yeah, so if we trace the English word back to its origins around, say, 1534, the definition was simply killing a sacrificial victim.
So no fire at all.
No inherent connection to fire whatsoever. It actually derives from the Latin word immolare, which meant to sprinkle with sacrificial meal.
Wait, like meal?
Right.
Like food?
Yeah, exactly. Specifically, it referred to a salted flour mixture. They called it molla salsa, and it was used in ancient Roman religion to prepare an offering to the gods.
Oh, wow.
Right. It wasn't until the late 1600s that the word began to figuratively mean destruction, specifically by fire.
That concept of sacrifice, of like making oneself an offering, is going to echo through basically everything we discussed today. But before we get to the philosophy of it, we have to face the physical reality.
Which is incredibly difficult to talk about.
It really is. Our sources detail the harrowing mechanics of what happens to the human body during this act, and it is brutally difficult to comprehend. Frequently, individuals use chemical accelerants, and the initial pain is described as completely excruciating.
But then a very grim biological failsafe kicks in. What's fascinating here is the physiological paradox of it all.
Right.
The sheer, overwhelming intensity of the heat eventually burns through the human nerve endings themselves.
Which is just terrifying to think about.
It is. So as the tissue damage becomes the most severe, the individual actually loses physical sensation in those deeply burned areas. But, you know, the flames are just the most visible element. The immediate cause of death during the act itself is very often the inhalation of toxic combustion products and superheated air.
Right, which just destroys the airway.
Exactly.
And for those who survive that initial stage, the body's internal reaction is just catastrophic. Once 25% of an adult's skin is burned, a massive systemic inflammatory response is triggered.
Yeah, the body just goes into complete crisis mode.
I was trying to wrap my head around this, and the best analogy I could think of is like a city's water infrastructure during a massive earthquake. Severe burns cause the body's capillaries to become highly permeable. So imagine a city's water pipes suddenly turning into Swiss cheese. The blood plasma just leaks out everywhere into the surrounding tissue.
That analogy is spot on. The body rapidly loses blood volume and essential fluids because the integrity of the vascular system is just compromised.
Your blood pressure just plummets.
Plummets completely. If that person isn't transported to a specialized burn center within a really critical 4-hour window, the likelihood of dying from sheer physiological shock skyrockets. They essentially die from a massive circulatory collapse.
And the statistics are just, they're heavy. You read the medical sources and they lay it out so coldly. If a person is under 40 years old and has burns over less than 80% of their body, they have roughly a 50% chance of survival.
A coin flip, basically.
Yeah. But the moment those burns exceed 80% coverage, that survival rate drops to just 20%.
And this highlights another crucial psychological paradox of the injuries. Because in an accidental fire, a person's biological instinct is to cover their face, right? Or roll on the ground or flee.
Which naturally mitigates the burns.
Right. Those actions lessen the depth of the burns. But in an act of self-immolation, the deliberate refusal of the individual to protect themselves is what produces those abnormally deep burns and the extreme toxic inhalation.
So the body is screaming to survive, and the mind actively overrides it.
Exactly. The mind just shuts down that instinct.
The fact that the body actively fights to survive this makes it clear that doing this requires a level of conviction most of us just can't fathom. So where does conviction that strong even come from?
Well, historically, it wasn't political at all. It was entirely religious. Building on that original etymological idea of a sacrificial offering, we find ancient roots spanning multiple cultures.
Yeah, if we look back centuries, particularly in India, this act is deeply woven into mythology and history. In Hinduism, for instance, you have the foundational myth of Sati.
Right, the goddess Parvati.
Exactly. According to the legend, an incarnation of the goddess Parvati set herself on fire after her father insulted her for marrying Shiva. And Shiva was an ascetic god, meaning a deity associated with severe self-discipline and, abstention from worldly pleasures.
You also see the historical cultural practice of Jauhar in the Mewar region.
Yeah, the Rajput women.
Right. They would undergo mass self-immolation during times of war. This was done specifically to avoid capture, enslavement, and rape by invading armies.
And it wasn't just mythology or wartime desperation either. We have documented historical accounts of philosophers and monks utilizing this act in antiquity. Take the account of Kalanos, an ancient Indian philosopher from Taxila.
Oh, the story with Alexander the Great.
Yes. Around 323 BCE, he actually accompanied Alexander the Great's army. But after falling ill, rather than succumb to disease and lose his physical autonomy, he literally stepped into a pyre and burned himself alive right in front of Alexander and his entire army.
Just incredible. And Kalanos wasn't an isolated case. There's also Sarmanachikas, who was a monk of the Sramana tradition. That was an ancient Indian religious movement focused on asceticism and liberation. He burned himself to death in Athens around 22 BC.
Wow.
Yeah. And as we move eastward into China, the earliest recorded self-immolation occurred in 396 AD by a monk named Fayu.
Right, the one with the incense.
Yes. He informed a ruling prince that he intended to burn himself alive. When the prince tried to intervene, Fayu publicly swallowed incense chips, wrapped his body in oiled cloth, and chanted as he set himself on fire. The historical texts actually describe the witnesses feeling a mixture of both grief and admiration.
Wait, I want to jump in here because reading through the sources, I was really surprised to find this wasn't just an exclusive Buddhist or Hindu practice.
Oh, absolutely not.
Right, you might assume this is purely tied to those specific religious doctrines. But the historian Jimmy Yu examined primary sources from the 16th and 17th centuries in China, and he found something completely different. Taoists and literati officials, so scholars and bureaucrats, they also engaged in ritualistic self-harm.
Yeah, it was much more widespread.
They would burn themselves or expose their naked bodies to the sun for prolonged periods as a form of self-sacrifice, sometimes even to procure rain during droughts. It was embedded in a much broader cultural landscape of using the body as a currency of offering.
And that broader cultural landscape is key to understanding the trigger points. When we analyze the historical record, a very distinct pattern emerges.
Like they don't just happen randomly.
Exactly. These acts don't happen in a vacuum. They often spike during periods of intense crisis, particularly when secular powers become actively hostile toward religion.
Right.
For example, in 7th century China, biographies record 5 monks who self-immolated in the mountains, specifically in response to a harsh systemic persecution of Buddhism by Emperor Wu of Northern Zhou.
So the act becomes a final, undeniable assertion of faith against an overwhelming secular force.
Exactly.
So it begins as a religious offering, a path toward enlightenment, or a desperate defense of faith against a hostile empire. But how does that ancient religious practice pivot into the ultimate modern political weapon? Because as we move into the 20th century, the context shifts dramatically.
It really does. The turning point for the modern era really centers on the South Vietnam Buddhist crisis in 1963. The country's majority Buddhist population was facing intense systemic persecution under the administration of the Catholic president, GandM. To protest this, several monks took action, most famously Thish Quang Luc, who immolated himself at a very busy intersection in Saigon.
I mean, imagine you're opening your morning newspaper in 1963, and you see that photograph of Thish Quang Luc sitting perfectly still, enveloped in flames, while surrounded by a stunned crowd. It is hard to overstate how that image shattered the geopolitical reality of the time.
It really did.
It completely changed how the world viewed the conflict in Vietnam.
And that single act created a massive ripple effect, reaching right into the heart of the United States. Between 1963 and 1971, researchers tracked almost 100 cases of self-immolation covered by major newspapers.
Just in the U.S.?
Yeah, largely connected to protests against the Vietnam War. One of the most prominent was Norman Morrison in 1965. He was an anti-war activist who doused himself in kerosene and set himself on fire directly below the Pentagon office of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Can an act of such immense, complete physical destruction ever truly be classified as nonviolence? Just because the violence is completely self-directed? I mean, it fundamentally challenges our basic definition of the word.
He really does.
Because a protester setting themselves on fire is, objectively, a violent image.
This raises a very important question, and it's a debate that philosophers and world leaders have grappled with ever since. Interpretations vary wildly depending on the political lens you apply. Take the 14th Dalai Lama, for example.
Okay.
He has argued that self-immolation can be viewed as a practice of nonviolence. His reasoning is that these individuals could easily use explosives to cause mass casualties and harm their opponents, but they consciously choose not to.
Right, they direct it inward.
Exactly. They restrict the ultimate sacrifice entirely to their own lives.
But obviously not everyone agrees with that classification.
Far from it. In the context of the Tibet and China conflict, where as of 2022, there have been 161 confirmed self-immolations in Tibet, the perspectives are diametrically opposed.
So how do the two sides view it?
Well, the Dalai Lama has characterized the underlying cause of these acts as cultural genocide by Chinese authorities. Conversely, the Chinese government has explicitly blamed the Dalai Lama and his supporters, stating that they are actively inciting and orchestrating these acts.
Right. And the U.S. usually tries to stay in the middle.
The United States historically has called on both sides to moderate their stances. But stepping back from the politics of any specific geopolitical conflict, what we see from a sociological perspective is a deep divide in how different cultures define violence and interpret martyrdom.
Which brings us to the final massive shift in this timeline, the globalization of the act in the media age. We see this ancient practice being utilized across radically different cultures for radically different causes. And the sociological mechanics behind why it works are fascinating.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, sociologists classify these events as a form of altruistic suicide.
Altruistic suicide.
Yes, that term is crucial. It differentiates the act from suicide driven by personal despair or mental health struggles. In altruistic suicide, the individual is acting on behalf of a group or a deeply held cause.
Right. It's not about them.
Exactly. The goal is not to cause material damage to infrastructure or to physically harm an opponent. The goal is maximum public visibility. The individual is offering their life to force a collective reckoning. They are using the absolute shock of the act to bypass normal, sluggish political discourse.
And once mass media entered the equation, the visibility of these acts scaled exponentially. We saw it spread to the Soviet bloc in 1968. Protesting against the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia, you had the Polish accountant Jan Palach, who became a massive symbol of resistance.
And then in 1972, a 19-year-old Lithuanian student named Romas Kalanta self-immolated to protest the Soviet regime. That act actually sparked widespread unrest in Lithuania.
And the sheer scale of this in India is hard to wrap your head around.
The statistics from India demonstrate how deeply this method of protest became embedded in certain political movements. In the year 2000 alone, there were as many as 1,451 reported self-immolations.
That is just staggering. Over 1,400 in 1 year.
It is. Many of these historically have been driven by intensely local domestic issues. For instance, the 1990 protests against caste-based reservations or protests by Tamils against the imposition of the Hindi language in Tamil Nadu. The mechanism is the same, elevating a local grievance to a life-or-death absolute.
But the most profound example of that mechanism triggering global change has to be the Middle East. The entire Arab Spring, a massive wave of revolutions that toppled multiple entrenched governments across North Africa and the Middle East in 2010 and 2011 was essentially ignited by one man.
Right, Mohammed Bouazizi.
Yes, a street vendor in Tunisia. He self-immolated to protest systemic police harassment and corruption.
And we have to ask how that single act sparked a revolution when so many other protests had failed.
Right, why that one?
The sociological tipping point occurred because Bouazizi's desperation perfectly mirrored the shared baseline of systemic frustration felt by the wider population. When you have a society already pushed to the brink by economic hardship and corruption, an undeniable altruistic act of supreme sacrifice shatters the apathy.
It wakes everyone up.
Exactly. It strikes directly at the emotional conscience of the public. That single act in Tunisia inspired protests in Algeria, Egypt, and eventually swept across the entire region.
You also see it mobilizing European citizens against modern corruption. In 2013, a Bulgarian photographer and mountaineer named Plemen Goranov set himself on fire in front of the Varna municipal building.
Protesting corruption, right?
Yeah, he was protesting alleged ties between organized crime and local government monopolies. And his death didn't just cause a fleeting moment of sadness. It galvanized massive public outrage.
Yeah.
It led directly to the resignation of both the local mayor and the national government. Citizens spontaneously built a memorial mound of stones at the site of his protest, a deeply symbolic collective display of public grief and solidarity.
And the modernization of how these acts are witnessed continues to evolve right up to this very moment. Think about the progression we've discussed today. We went from ancient monks swallowing incense in front of a small, localized crowd of royalty to the 1960s, where photographs in newspapers shocked the world days later. Today, modern individuals are using instantaneous, borderless global broadcasting networks. We see this acutely with the recent protests in the United States regarding the ongoing Gaza war.
Yeah, the factual record of recent years shows a stark evolution in methodology. In December 2023, a protester self-immolated outside the Israeli consulate in Atlanta, draped in a Palestinian flag. Then, in February 2024, Aaron Bushnell, an active-duty U.S. Air Force service member, self-immolated outside the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., in protest against the United States' ongoing support for Israel.
But what marked a truly significant shift in how the act is consumed was that Bushnell actively filmed and live-streamed his own death on the platform Twitch.
He broadcast it live to the world.
Exactly. That live-streaming element changed the paradigm entirely. And the incidents continued throughout the year. In September 2024, Matt Nelson self-immolated outside the Israeli consulate in Boston, leaving behind a pre-recorded video urging the U.S. government to stop sending weapons to Israel.
And then there's the incident in D.C.
Right. Just weeks later, in October 2024, a photojournalist named Samuel Mena Jr. survived an attempt to self-immolate at a pro-Palestinian protest in front of the White House. The desire to make the public bear witness remains exactly the same as it was for Kolanos centuries ago.
But the technology ensures the witness pool is now the entire connected globe in real time.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? We've traced a path from a Latin word describing salted flour through ancient religious devotions in India and China to a deeply visceral, widely broadcast political statement used in Vietnam, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and modern America. Why should you, listening to this right now, care about something so extreme?
It's a heavy question.
It is, because understanding self-immolation is ultimately about understanding the absolute outer limits of human conviction. It forces us to examine the lengths to which desperate people will go when they feel they have no other way to pierce through the noise of a society that has seemingly stopped listening.
And that leaves us with a critical, somewhat unsettling thought for the future. We live in an era of unprecedented digital information overload.
Oh, for sure.
We can scroll past profound global tragedies on our phones in mere seconds while, waiting in line for coffee. So how will the nature of ultimate protest evolve next?
That is the big question.
If even the most extreme, unimaginable acts of human sacrifice risk getting swept away in the endless, numb churn of a social media feed, how will future generations attempt to make the world stop, look, and actually listen?
A question that definitely lingers long after the flames are gone. We'll leave you to mull that over. Until next time.